I've got, it must be the day of fours. I've got four aspects of what I want to talk about too, in terms of the notion of professional learning, about the Charter, about how I read some of the research and professional learning relating to it, and I obviously want to put a challenge to AITSL and this group. Let me start. When I first saw the Charter, the standards, it was kind of like, here we go again. I went to Google last night and Googled charters for professional, I see the most modern part of this is we've changed professional development to professional learning. Hundreds of them. And I wanted to relate back to a couple of experiences in my career. When I first went to work in North Carolina, I had the job with the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards. And the first job they gave me was to get all the professional standards there were for teachers, right around America, across the states, all the jurisdictions. I literally ended up with a room of boxes. My job was to review them. The bottom line's simple. They had absolutely zero effect. Another job I had is I was the psychometric advisor to NCATE, the National Council for Accreditation of Teacher Education, and they have quite a few thousand education institutions they accredit. And at the time, in the late 90s, they were very nervous because many of the teachers that had passed those standards were failing in the schools. And so what I learned from that experience, and my major message about this document here, is standards without an understanding of their impact and their assessment, their evaluation, quite frankly, are only worth the paper they're written on. And so my major challenge to AITSL moving forward is, how do you now come up with evidence about the success of the implementation of these standards? One of my worries in academia and in the business of education is we love to study failure. There's an incredible amount of success out there in our systems. And I would hope that we have an opportunity with these standards to look at where success is, articulate success, welcome it, embrace it, and demand it of the system. We know a tremendous amount about professional learning. In fact, it seems strange to me at times that some of our adults in the professional learning seem to think not for them, when that is the very thing we ask kids to do. To come to an institution that deliberately is set out with a focus on learning, with a curriculum, with an assessment, with a whole set of understandings about pedagogy, and participate in that, and because of that they're going to be better citizens when they leave us around 15, 16, 17. And so it seems a mystery at times that we then seem to think it doesn't apply to us. What applies to us is osmosis. We will learn, just leave us alone. This is the business we're in. And so I have no difficulties with trying to get a better understanding about the learning of the adults in our education system in the same way that we've spent eons looking at the education of the students. So it shouldn't be difficult. We almost shouldn't have a document like this, even though I understand why we do. Where I want to start, though, is leading from what Michael said. And my view is if you don't start respecting the teachers where they are, professional learning has no import. And if I know anything, teachers have incredibly strong theories. And if you don't start by understanding what the theories are that the teachers bring to the professional learning, you're walking uphill the whole way. Now, in many cases, those theories I have no difficulty with. My point is we need to know them. I do get very frustrated when I hear teachers' theories about, for instance, the latest mind storm that has gone through New Zealand. As some idiot woke up one morning and said, I've solved it. There's only two ways people think, a boy way and a girl way. And we've got this whole rhetoric about boys' education. And then when I look at the work Janet Hyde's done, the work I've done on this, where I've got many millions of kids in the sample to ask, does it make a difference? There is no difference between boys and girls in Australia in terms of achievement impact. So why are we inventing theories about why they're different? We have a whole rhetoric about discovery learning, constructivism, about learning styles that has got zero evidence for them anywhere. And my point being is if you don't start by acknowledging that teachers come with those kind of theories, you've got to wonder what they're based on. And one of the things that strikes me as I do my work on visible learning is, like, you kind of think as the arrogant academic, yeah, maybe I kind of do know some answers. So why don't they share these? And the reason's simple. I haven't got enough listening and respecting skill to start by understanding where the people are coming from. And when I listen about the learning styles nonsense, for instance, it doesn't take long after you've listened to it to say, but wouldn't it be more powerful if you as the teacher had multiple styles of teaching? And you can reap all the benefits from how you believe about it. And you can get quite an impact from that. And so where do you start from this notion of teachers having war stories? And I don't mean that in a negative sense. They have a very strong set of war stories. And so when I come along with the evidence I have, I know it's going to crunch. The same in the debate about professional learning. When you go into a school and say, we're going to now have professional learning and we're going to have these kinds of impacts, you need to understand where they're coming from. And as I go around schools and see their lists of professional learning, many of them are exciting and many of them make me sick. Where are they starting from? Let me go a next step. And that is the one thing that I found from all the work I've done that surprised the heck out of me and now drives me is that in education, everything works. And so I have no time for the concept of what works, because the answer is everything. And just a couple of slides to put you in the picture, particularly for the later part of my comments. What I've been doing is I'm now up to 900 meta-analyses, around 260 million kids, trying to take all the things I can to put along this continuum to understand what's up here and what's down there. And the average effect across them all is around about 0.4. And so what drives me, for those who know me and have worked with me, is 0.4 is written on my forehead here, because on average, that's the kind of effect you get. Now, if you don't understand effect size and Z scores, and all those kind of things, it doesn't matter. It is the comparison. Because here's 240 million kids. And the point I want to make, the red zone, that's 0 and below. That is where there is something that happens that actually decreases achievement. There's virtually nothing. And a couple of those kind of very sensible, many of them. The effect of 1 or 2 disruptive kids on the achievement of all the kids in the class is minus 0.3. And when you take those out, 95 to 98% of things we do to people to enhance their learning works. And so you know the story. All you need to enhance kids' achievement is a pulse. And I think that's the thing that we don't realize in this business. Now, it turns out that it's not a bad normal distribution. Set it around the 0.4. What I want to study in my life is what is the understanding, what's going on for that group of teachers, which is about 50 to 60% if you look at it in terms of a distribution, that systematically get effect sizes greater than the average, compared to those that get it less than the average. Whereas 99% of our debates in education, particularly at systems levels, is how to enhance achievement. Wrong question. On the other hand, it's the right question if you like that way, because anything you say will work. One of our 3 ministers in Victoria goes to bed last night, wakes up this morning with a bright idea. It will work. So how do we strive up there? And so kind of, Tony, Marjorie, you know where I'm going. If the professional learning doesn't have an impact greater than the average, we're doing the wrong thing. And so how can we constantly ask, what is it that gets us to success? Just 2 slides to give you the extreme, the disasters, the things that hopelessly don't work. And I'm echoing the point, it's the trouble with following Michael Fuller, he says everything. Echoing the point, the majority of things that we love to debate, not only at the political level, but also in the staff rooms and amongst the parents, are the structural things. The things you can actually see and touch and do and legislate. They don't work. They're well less than 0.4. All that, you can see them there. I've just given you a bit of a snippet of the sample, and I'm trying to suggest to you that will dominate the debates. We love to have programs of professional learning, I suggest to you, about things that don't change us. We don't mind change, as long as you don't change me. But if I go to the other end of the scale, you get the stuff that works, and it's heavily embedded in that third stall. And where I'm at in my own thinking is I'm not actually interested personally anymore in teaching. I'm interested in the impact of teaching. I don't want to have a debate about direct instruction or whether you should use reciprocal teaching, all those kind of things. I care about the impact of those things, because what I find across the whole distribution of effect sizes is teacher effects everywhere, below and above 0.4. So it's not true that teachers make the difference. It's teachers thinking certain ways. And it's the thinking that matters. And when I try and sum up everything I know in this business, it's that. And you can wait for my new book in December, or you can get Michael's one that came out a couple of months ago, that had a chapter on Know Thy Impact. Because as far as I'm concerned, what drives me is those teachers, those systems, those school leaders who understand their impact. The concept is the teacher is the evaluator. In the same way I want to argue to you this afternoon is that we should be asking about professional development in terms of the evaluation of its impact subsequently on the students. Too often we ask about the impact of the professional development on the teacher. I want to go the next step. Now, just to make sure I'm an equal opportunity critic this afternoon, I also want to criticise the most bankrupt institution I know in this business, teacher education. And the reason I think they're bankrupt is they're constantly solving the wrong problem, which is, wrong problem, how do we improve the quality of the teachers entering the teaching force? The right problem to me is one of the reasons I came to Melbourne, because it's one of the few that have actually tried to do this. What is the impact that we're having on the students of our student teachers? And you do totally different things. And that's the kind of message I want to get across this afternoon with respect to the whole professional learning. It ain't about professional learning. It is about the impact of that professional learning on the students. Now, hey, it's not an easy connection. Theories of action are lovely things. But there needs to be a corpus of evidence that relates to that impact beyond the satisfaction of the teachers. And the last of my four things here is the worry I have about too often for teachers, for school leaders, professionalism is defined by their autonomy. In the same way, schools like this notion of autonomy. Here's my simple answer, guys. Nobody has the right to go into a school and systematically get effect sizes less than 0.4. And one of my troubles with most policies is they're invented to solve the bottom of the problem, and then they're applied to the top half of the distribution, and we wonder why they don't work. Linda Bennigsen has been working, for instance, at the nature of principals in struggling schools compared to very successful schools. In struggling schools, you need quite direct leadership. In non-struggling schools, indirect leadership works. So one policy doesn't fit all. I'd have a strong hunch that if you go back and look at No Child Left Behind, it works very well in those states that were below the average. But for those states above the average, it probably had zero to nothing impact. In terms of achievement, it might have an incredible impact on frustration and the deviation of attention and resources to the wrong thing. So my worry is we have to be also very careful when we prescribe this kind of notion that we're not trying to fix the bottom and therefore have no effect on the top. I care about the top, and I care about getting more people in that group called the top. So where does professional learning fit all in this? Well, I think it's about these two things. And the second one is about the impact of the character of both the teachers and the students. And so let me then come specifically to the Charter. The first thing is, there is, and I'm delighted to see this, and I have to say, Marjorie, it wasn't there in the first version, so I appreciate that. I know others have made this comment, not just me. But there is a beginning of an emphasis in here on the impact of the professional learning on these kinds of outcomes. And as Lawrence Invigerson and the ACR team have long argued, getting away from evaluating professional learning in terms of whether the tea was warm or the seats were hard. Can we evaluate it in terms of that kind of impact? I'm not sure about this autonomy one, number two. I have this hunch that too often some schools choose professional development learning as they choose their movies. For a particular time, make it entertaining, make me think, but when I go home, it doesn't matter. How do we get that more sustained? And I'm going to challenge you to come up over the next year with some evidence from our communities about professional learning that has had an impact on student performances, to start to drive the debate about what effective PD looks like, not just, I'm sorry, all PD. I'll come back to that one. There's nothing in here about content knowledge. Now, the scariest thing I know from the visible learning work I've done is that teachers' subject matter knowledge counts for zero. It's a 0.9 effect, 0.09 effect. And that scares me. And that says we're doing something drastically wrong. Now, you could tell me it should, and I know it should. But how I've looked at it, Mary Kennedy's done a synthesis of the qualitative literature, it doesn't. It doesn't in here. Maybe I know why. We've got to change that. And we've got to change and have a better understanding about why subject matter knowledge has not counted up to now in terms of its impact on kids. I love the move to collaborative teams, professional learning communities, all those kind of things, provided they get beyond building teams. One of my major arguments in this work I'm doing at the moment is how we can get teachers more involved as they plan lessons to work together to do it. Like, one of the beauties of our profession, we are the best critics of each other in the world. So how do we optimise that power to criticise before we teach? And the other thing I like to do with the work I do with teachers is to get them to construct the assessment they're going to give at the end when they start. Because that clearly articulates to them what success looks like. Because so often what happens is when you get to the end of the lesson, you create an assessment about what you've taught, as opposed to what the concepts you perhaps wish to teach. I think the same kind of notion here, I'd be saying to communities going from professional learning, what is it you want to change? Tell me up front. And there are a multitude of these. I'm not suggesting just one, and I'm certainly not suggesting just test scores. But how do we get that success criteria up front so that the collaborative teams can have a focus to which they move to? The focus isn't what was delivered. The focus is the impact it has subsequently back in the school. A lot of the work that I've been doing in New Zealand over the last 12 years has been this notion of overall teacher judgments. And like all good concepts, the OTJ acronym now is right throughout the school system. And in fact, New Zealand's going to an election in the next 3 weeks, and OTJs are a very big part of it. We ask the teachers to defend their judgments in maths, science, phys ed, you name it. And we say to them, if you use a test, you failed, and if you don't use a test, you failed. Ultimately, what we want to look at is how you make judgments about kids and their performance. Now, a lot of our teachers dislike this intensely. And so when you talked before about how you're making the evidence public, this is one of the things I want to work on too, is how do you make teachers' judgments explicit? When I work in schools, and started doing some here in Victoria, there's some stunning stuff going on with teachers who can defend their judgment. But when they do it in groups, the discussion often closes down very quickly because that's your judgment, this is mine. How do we collectively get a concept of progression? Because if we don't, it's too much of a random crapshoot every time a kid touches a new teacher. And I think this is one of the things that professional learning can have a dramatic effect on, is how we can get common understandings of progression and challenge in our schools, so that when kids do go up the grades, when they do go up the quality, the nature of the work they're doing, they are increasingly challenged by teachers who have common understandings of progress. I have to ask what's excluded. It's always my test in any document, and I'm afraid I don't see anything excluded. I want something excluded. It is just not true that everything works. That is one of your next jobs. One of the things that I've been doing in this area, and again, I don't want to keep going back to New Zealand, but it was my last 12 years, is I've had the same kind of role in a small country. You can do this with various ministers, and being the advisor of 7 out of the last 8. One only lasted 6 weeks, so I missed that one. And one of the things I'm saying to them constantly is that in the professional development area, one of your concerns is your model of doing it in terms of who you employ. I'm also on the board of a company that has a large role in the education in Abu Dhabi, and they've gone through so many consultants, it's incredible, for very limited effect as it turns out. And what I convinced the New Zealand government to consider, or the minister to consider, is start to put some onus on the professional development people and say to them that if you don't get, with the school you're working with, the impacts that you're looking for, you either don't get employed again, or we don't pay you. In Abu Dhabi, we put $20 million up for grabs. We have 30 schools there, and the argument was if you don't get these effects in these schools over the year, as the professional development providers with the schools, you don't get paid. We got 29 of our 30 schools through. It was an incredible attention to having an impact. This is what the New Zealand government now says to PD providers. They've done a lot of work looking at the kind of growth change, and I'm starting to look at the NAPLAN stuff, thank you Peter, in terms of what the kind of growth change is, and the good news there is that the growth change is reasonably correlated with the socioeconomic status of the schools. You can get growth right across our system, and saying what kind of growth changes, and in the New Zealand system now it is hills to the fires for PD providers. I would hate this to be thought of as something where PD providers can go mad. They are implicated in having success. And I'd be asking you to think seriously about that so that we are all working together, and not when I go in and do PD and nothing happens, I'm going to say, it was them. We are good at that. So let me look for a moment then at this notion of how I see the research on PD. And I'm putting this up to make sure that no one leaves this room thinking that I'm asking for just narrow test scores. As we did with the with the NCATE, we said to the teacher education institutions, we're going to ask you 2 questions. What evidence can you show us you're having an impact, and what are you doing about it? Now, they disliked it intensely. They said, no, you just tell us. And we said, no. Now, what we had to do next, Tony Marjorie, what I'm suggesting has next, is you come up with examples of the kind of evidence you would accept. Because we don't want to constrain the schools to all using the same methods, because it's just not true out there. They all have the same problems and issues and directions. And for about my last sort of 15 years of my career, as I've developed the New Zealand assessment system, and that those two questions have driven me. I've actually convinced the Education Review Office, Inspectorate Office, when they go into schools, don't go and ask for the data, because the minute you do that, you'll own it. Go in and ask, what evidence have you got? And the same with professional development. What evidence can you produce before you do the PD, as you do it, that you're having an impact, and what are you doing about the consequences of that? And I'm suggesting that that will get away from the prescriptive notion. It opens up opportunities. It gives the communities that we work with, who are incredibly diverse, multiple ways of showing they're successful, but it does put the emphasis back on impact. So what's the PD research say? Well, across the 50-odd thousand people I've got on the sample that ask what the effect of PD, it's pretty impressively good news. I don't think we should ever imagine that professional learning doesn't work. It does work. On my scale, it's way up there. But, like all things with but, you never remember the word before it. I'll remind you of the word before it. It's variable. Its least effect is on kids. And I think the mission that we should be saying here in Australia, thanks to this, is how can we have that kind of impact as well? And certainly this also says to me that we shouldn't be measuring our impact solely in terms of teachers and any kind of evidence about the learning that's accrued, how it changes their behaviour and how they felt about it. Not enough. Important, but not enough. But that 0.37 is below my line, not much, but it gives me hope that we can make a difference in that area. When I go further and ask what's the most effective types, it kind of looks, when you look at those down that list there, it kind of feels like teaching. It kind of feels what good teaching is. Because I'm going to contrast that with the least effective. And the other thing about this list is there's a few of those that I hardly ever see. Now, one of the things that actually enthralls me from Barry McGall's telling me, and I see it in the evidence of PISA, is I'm looking to Poland, which is probably the fastest growing country in terms of their changes. And I look to see what they, when you ask the question, what did they do that made the difference? It's kind of like what Finland did 30 years ago, and perhaps some of the other countries. They abolished any kind of notions of homogeneity, stream schools, stream kids. I think there's a tremendous amount we can learn by mixing up kids and mixing up teachers. And I look at that number 4 there about mixing teachers across high and primary school, and you see that's when you get major impacts. To me, it's they're bringing different worldviews together and they're not assuming anymore. Let's look at the least effective. Stuff, resources. And so the message is that we shouldn't stop for a moment when we look at professional learning and say it's something we can do to people. It involves the same acts, quality of teaching, that it does with kids. And I want to see more about this. It isn't just going out there and giving teachers stuff. It is about changing their minds, changing their views, gaining their minds, gaining their views to convince them it is about their impact. I want to finish with my colleague. I've spent 12 years in the Auckland factory with people like Vivian Robinson, Helen Timperley. It's great to go to work because, like all good places you go to, they're wonderful critics of your own work. And Helen's done, I think, some of the most impressive work and started off with the notion of that I only want to ask the question about what professional learning makes the difference to kids' learning. And as she started her work, and I was part of that team when it started, is that we ruled out anything to do with teachers, not because they're not interesting, the outcomes on teachers, but that wasn't the focus. That got rid of most of the research. And she ended up with not as many studies, about 70 odd, and she again came up with similar conclusions that I showed there before in terms of the impact on teachers' thinking, teachers' knowledge is much higher than it is on the impacts of students. And she came up with these 7 themes. And I think they're very powerful themes, and one of the things I look for in here is how is this mirrored? Now, it's not here, but I'm challenging you now to go to the next step and take this kind of work to say, how can we now get word out to our community that there are some things we know in this business? That we do know that just doing it within a school may not have the sharp edge, and it may not question the assumptions you're making. Now, one of the pieces of work I did many years ago with one of the ministers of education was closing schools. Now, word of advice, don't ever do that. Even the worst schools Even when the community knew they were the worst schools, they weren't going to change them. The fight to keep them was ginormous, beyond all comprehension. Even when some of them were toxic. And so when you go down to that school level in some of those systems and asking them what they want to do, you're just inviting a disaster. When you go into the schools that are the opposite, as I said before, you leave them alone. And it's almost that notion of earned autonomy that I'm trying to say here. When you look at notions like involvement of external experts, I don't think it's because the external experts are any good. I think it's because you're bringing in a different mindset. And that notion of of teachers talking to teachers about teaching. The most anal study I've ever done, in fact it was with Helen, is we measured in minutes what teachers talked about at morning, tea time, lunch and PD sessions. And it's in primary schools, it's about 3 Ks. We love to talk about the kids, we love to talk about the curriculum, and obviously in New Zealand we love to talk about kicking footballs. In high school we added assessment. 1 minute a month, teachers talked about teaching. We almost have a whole psyche in our schools that says, Michael, you teach different to me, and I respect that. And what I'm saying, don't you dare touch me. And that's one of our problems in our system, is that whole teaching act, not only is it private, we don't even talk about it. Now, as an aside, we did that study because when we introduced our assessment package, when the minister asked me, how would you judge you're successful? He expected me to say that I could meet all the Peter Hill standards of psychometric brilliance, which is my cup of tea. And I said to him, no, that's an assumed. My standard is, do I increase the amount of time teachers talk about teaching? So we went in and we did have success. So there is an explanation for anality, but I still think it's fascinating about how we can get that number 5, how we can open it up, how we can get away from that crazy thing that we were doing for 20 or 30 years about best practice. When teachers said, look, this is best practice, and I'll tell you about it. And the whole message was, that's it. When they failed to realise, that was it. It's what they did to that practice. And it's how we can get that teacher's notion, talking about teaching, I think is very powerful. So let me sort of end by giving you some challenges, Aidsel. I personally think that this is a major step forward. One of my challenges to you is you've now done this. You've now done professional teaching standards. You've looked at leaders. I'm sure you've got some other things up your sleeve. My worry is you're creating the 3 legs of the stool and there's no bench yet. So how do they relate to each other? How do we get one thing out of this so we're not giving 14 messages to the school system? I think you're right for that. So I'm not asking you to do more work in one way, but I would love you to think of that. I also would love you to think that notion forward is, how do you start creating a debate around this country about effectiveness? How do you get away from everything goes? How do you get away from the whole rhetoric of what works? It's a disastrous language because everything works. How do you start to say and help our communities identify what excellence means? Now, my view is that what I'd love you to do is to come up with ways to help schools evaluate the impact of their learning on the performance of the kids. I would hate it to be prescribed. There's clearly no one way, and furthermore, I know that it won't be adopted. And so that notion of how you can start to build that evidence, as we did at NCATE through websites, as we did with the NCA in New Zealand, is to get that community out to say, this is acceptable evidence that answers the first question. What is the impact of the PD on the students in the school? And then the second question, again, how do you help get the consequences out? Where to next? Given we've gone and done this, how do you make it a systematic program and not a one-off program? And so, in my language, which is very narrow, is how do you get those effect sizes so that all our community, all our teachers, join what I think is an incredibly successful business that we're in, and that we drive the system from the most successful and not put all the onus in seeing PD, PL as fixing the problems. I think this is a wonderful challenge. It is yours.